So good to see all of you here today, and I'm excited to be here as we continue our series called Reminded. And today, we're going to talk about a word that often either gets neglected or really misunderstood, and that is the idea of obedience. And who is it, or what is it, or maybe more importantly, why is it that you obey somebody? Right? Why do you do what someone's asked you to do? More than likely, if you start to sort of play that thread out very long, what you'll find is the reason you obey someone is so they won't be mad at you or so you won't get in trouble. It's kind of the ultimate end of that question. That makes sense? Kind of a good starting point for everybody. I obey my curfew so I don't get grounded forever. And a lot of us end up sort of bringing that into our relationship with God. And I've been talking about this and most of you are probably sick of it by now. But the good thing is whenever you start to get sick of something, we're probably getting close to where we need to be in order to understand it. So I've been talking about these two ways of life, two sort of governing authorities, two ways of ruling our lives. One under the rule of law, which is really the way the system of the world works, and the other is this rule of love. And obedience under the rule of law looks one way, and obedience under the rule of love looks another way. And so that's what I want for us to explore today as we look at one of perhaps the most troubling passages in the Bible. One of the things that in Genesis 22, I guess I should tell you where it is, Genesis 22. For those of you who are not familiar with what that passage is, it's the story of Abraham and his son Isaac. It's the story of God, who is the creator, who we learn about as being love and loving and good and faithful, asking his faithful servant to sacrifice his only son, to basically take the promise that God had given to Abraham in his son Isaac, and then to essentially kill him. And if you sort of think about this, it's very troubling because it does not sound like a faithful God. It doesn't sound like a good God. It sounds very much sadistic and cruel if we really get honest. And so as we look at this, I want us to kind of enter into it to explore what we see, what you see, because a lot of us grew up and you read stories like that and you know that God is good, and so you just go, oh, it just fits in this frame, and you don't really process it any deeper other than it just happened, and that's what it is. We don't really process it. Worked out okay, and so that makes God good. We don't really push into it any deeper, at least I don't. And so the reason I say this is because what we find when we read through the Old Testament, the reason I read the Bible is, and I've said this for years and years and years, I used to read it to extract principles to apply to my life and make my life work better. And then I realized that what God is doing in and through his word is he is revealing himself to us. As we read God's encounter with human beings, as we see the grinding of human history throughout the law and the prophets and the Psalms and the poems and all the different things that make up the Old Covenant of our Bibles, what I realize is that I'm learning who God is. And I'm also getting glimpses into how he is, how he operates, what he allows, how he interacts with me. And so I want to look a little bit deeper at this scenario or this story today. And my premise in this whole series is that we were reminded is that sacrifices are these places or these ways in which we are reminded of something that we desperately need to be reoriented or reminded about. And my premise has been that our posture of surrender is typically a reaction to something we regret. We come to church and we go, I need to surrender this habit. I need to surrender cussing too much or drinking too much or yelling too much. I need to surrender my anger. I need to surrender whatever it is. We think of it as sort of a reaction to something that's not going well, and we're going to offer that up to God. And it's usually our attempt to stop doing something. Sometimes it's to stop doing something in order to hope that was maybe the cork that kept something good from happening because you keep doing the same thing over and over. God is withholding his favor from you, or that something hasn't worked out from you. So we have this sort of system by which we promise and hope if we do better, then things will go better. And this is all rooted in this way in which we are so accustomed to living. And so what I think is really interesting, because a lot of us do in this series or in this system of the law, it fundamentally operates by systems or standards. There's something that we set up and we go, okay, we've got to do these things, and this is how, sort of a standard here. And what this does is we then live our lives, we behave in order to prove that we measure up. And if we measure up, right, if we measure up, we will find that our behavior was acceptable. And so this is sort of our approach in almost everything. And a lot of it trickles over into the way we relate to other people. It trickles into most everything that we do. It's tell me what to do and I'll do it. If I live up to that, if I perform well, if I prove it, then we find this way to move forward. And this creates a very precarious way for us to relate in the world around us, and it certainly creates a terrifying way to relate to God. I've talked to numerous people throughout this series or over the last few weeks of people when I talked about this idea that we are learning to live as those who are forgiven. That forgiveness is something that has been done for us. And you can feel this tension like, well, what about? How is it that we can owe God nothing? How can that be? Because that just doesn't sound what I've heard my whole life, because God expects things from me and all this. And I want to tell you, those things are still true, but it's true for much different reasons than what we think. And this is why we have to be reoriented. What most of us have approached this whole way of doing things is, what does God expect from me, and how can I live up to his expectations? And we often end up stumbling over things, particularly in this book of Leviticus that was kind of the spark plug for this whole series. This idea of Leviticus, which is just this book of laws, of rules, and then corresponding sacrifices to atone for us when we break those rules. And the rules in Leviticus are strange. Some of them are obvious, but some of them are very, very strange. And the sacrifices seem even weirder to us, especially in our modern, from our modern perspective. And what I want for us to see is that Leviticus occurred at a really interesting point in Israel's history. Israel had just come out of generations of slavery. They were living under an oppressive rule. And what happened is they moved out of slavery, they moved into this promise of freedom. They were living under one rule, and now they were about to come underneath another. We talked about this in the first week, right? We've talked about this. That what happens when we leave one rule where everything is we have excuses and reasons why we are the way we are, and we move into another where we are now responsible for the future that's ahead of us. We need to be reoriented, or else terrible things happen. What happened to the Israelites? They come out of the desert, or they come out of slavery, and they move into the desert. They encounter the Red Sea. The Red Sea's in front of them. Their first thinking is, oh my gosh, this God who delivered us out of Egypt, out of slavery, he has brought us out in the desert to just die. In fact, what they said was there not enough graves in Egypt that we could have just all died there instead of bring us out here in the desert to die? All right, they get a little further on and see the miracle. The Red Sea parted. The Red Sea parts, they move through it. They get out in the desert a little bit further, and now they're hungry. And they start going, you know what, we had 3 squares back in Egypt. Do you know how much better life was in Egypt? And they start sort of calculating how can they go back. And now this is what happens to us without a reordering. What the Leviticus is, with all of its detail, with all of its construction, with all of its structure, is a way to reorient us to a new rule. One thing you'll see if you read the Bible carefully, and this is part of why I try to present the gospel like this, the sin and the war against sin is not primarily moral. It's primarily authoritative. It's primarily, I say that 10 times, it's primarily what governs your affections and your allegiances and what you're going to do with your life, what you're going to give yourself to. It's not just trying to uphold the moral standard of behavior. It's trying to figure out what you're going to give your allegiance and affections to. And the reason is, and this requires a radical reordering, or else we're going to want to go back to the way things were. We said this, and this is how we talked about this, that familiar misery is sometimes more appealing than unfamiliar hope. To move into the promise of freedom under this new way of life, when it seems uncertain and you're not sure if you can do it, or you're not sure how it's going to turn out, the temptation to go back is really appealing. This is why a lot of people, I think, are stuck in their relationship with God. Because God met you in a really powerful way, and you were convinced to that, and you knew that, and maybe you trusted him for the first time, and then you start to move out, and you can't figure out for the life of you how things are going to work out for you. And so the easiest thing to do is just to go back to the way things were, where you can control things. And then we're talking about the gospel is very different than what a lot of you have grown up with, and myself included. But this is why it's so important, because what we're talking about when we are invited to sacrifice under the new covenant, it's for a much different reason. It's a reminder of the required reordering that is necessary in order for us to learn to live under this rule of love. If the law creates a system, which a lot of us like, this is how marriages work. You cook, I'll clean. It's a system, and it works. As long as you do your part, I'll do my part. But if you don't do your part, you're in trouble. And then what ends up happening is the reason you do your part, the reason you obey, is to avoid trouble. And it's a system. If you measure up, everything's cool. But if you don't, right, there's trouble. So under the rule of love, God establishes what he had intended from the beginning, and that is not that we are governed by a series of rules and laws, but that something else governs us, that we live in a relationship. And in Western American culture, this is a more foreign concept than a lot of us know. We live in a hyper-individualistic culture. We've grown up in it. Almost all of us, our primary concern as Americans, and this is not wrong, this is not bad, this is just the reality. The primary concern is individual rights. What that does is it means that individual rights are the highest value. Therefore, individualism just becomes the way in which we operate. It's all of us. We're all affected by it. So it has a shaping force on the way we see and perceive relationships. The other thing we have, I think, in our culture that's a little bit more current is the idea that now not only do we have a hyper-individualistic culture, we also have, in addition to that, a chronic individual branding, a personal brand. Everybody has to have their personal brand. And what this does is this further contributes to this misunderstanding of what it means to actually live in relationships. That the rule of love operates under sacrifice. It operates by what we're willing to give of ourselves for the sake of another, without regard for what we're going to get in return. This is a radical departure from the way most of us are accustomed to living. The foundation of a relationship, of a governance, of the sort of the foundation of this model is trust. It all depends on trust. And make no mistake about it. When you talk about living under a rule of love, it's not licensed to do whatever you want to do. But what it is, it's a call, because to live in this system means not only you have to learn how to trust, but you have to learn how to be trustworthy, how to steward the trust of another. And we're going to talk about that in a series later on. But my idea is when we think about this idea that we're called to sacrifice, this whole sacrificial system under the new covenant, what does this mean for us? And I begin to ask you, and I would sort of kind of invite you to ask this question, and we've been talking about this. What if sacrifice isn't what you give up? It isn't the thing that you're withholding. It's not the bad habit. It's not your sort of stubborn refusal to let go of the past. What if it wasn't what you give up, but what you were willing to make available? What if there was something available for you in this? What might you see? What might you discover? The passage that kind of sparked this was Romans 12:1. This is Paul writing. He says, I appeal to you, therefore. And therefore is a giant word that we don't have time to go into that today. But I appeal to you by the mercies of God, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies, your physical bodies, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual act of worship. One of the things that was lost on me, or that I think is lost on us, when we think about offering an acceptable sacrifice to God, is the reality that God actually accepts them. This is a big deal. Because a lot of us, our approach over here is to continue to prove that we are acceptable. You got to keep measuring up. You got to keep proving that you're acceptable, because your acceptability wanes or fades. And so we're talking about this reordering, where we are reordering our lives. Our sacrifice is no longer sacrifice to get God to forgive us or to prove to him that we're sorry, but rather we are offering ourselves as one who is forgiven. We are reordering around our lives as those who live in forgiveness and as those who are forgiven. And I've heard this a million times. People are just like, well, Mike, if you don't have the threat of punishment, man, people are just not going to behave. I heard so many sermons on hell growing up. And I was probably 18 or 19. I began to wonder, if the best God can do is threatening me, I'm not sure that's the full picture. Like if a parent is the only thing you can do is to threaten your kids to ground them, it's like not a super good. If you don't do this, if we don't have threat, how in the world are you going to get people to behave? This says more about our own depravity and willingness to use each other than it does about the fragility of forgiveness or grace. These are the most powerful forces in the world. They shape human beings more prevalently and pervasively than anything else on the planet. So these are not subtle forces. These are very powerful if we understand what they are. But most of us are too busy trying to create, like, what's the list that we're expecting? What's the standard? And we ask questions like, is this right or is this wrong? Those are not bad questions, please hear me. They're just not sufficient. Most of us, when we come to try to figure out if what we're doing is acceptable to God, is this right or is this wrong? And then when we do that, we begin to look in the Bible to see if we can find a verse that says yes or no to this. I've heard people tell me this, and I grew up like this. It's like, hey, it's all black and white to me, right? It's just one or the other. Y'all have heard this before? Some of you might be like this. That's how I grew up my whole life. And about 10 years ago, as a discipline, y'all know I keep a journal. Did y'all know that? And so in there, I carry markers because I studied architecture and we used markers all the time. So I always had markers with me. I love markers. And I carried my pens, and then I bought a pack of gray markers. Do you know why? To remind me every day that everything ain't always black and white. And I began to discover some things. Because I'd spent my whole life trying to separate. If it's wrong, you don't do it. If it's right, you do it. Now, please hear me. Am I saying that it's unimportant? No. What I'm saying is it's not enough. What the scriptures actually teach us, if you get into Hebrews, and I've been doing these little videos on this over the last couple of weeks, there'll be a third one coming out this week on my Instagram, but they're Hebrews 10, this is how it starts off. It says, the law is only a shadow. The law is only the shadow. It is not the reality itself. What color is a shadow? It's gray. It's gray. And what it does, it provides a shape. It provides an outline. It allows us to see something, just not the whole thing. And in fact, what I've stopped doing is I don't carry gray markers anymore. Now I'll do something different because what I've learned that what Jesus came to do is to fulfill the law, and in fulfilling the law, he actually turns the gray into color. He helps us to see what it's actually intended to be. And that's how I want for us to read this old covenant story of Abraham today. That's why I want to look at this, because for a lot of us, what we end up doing is in our attempts to try to figure out how to get ourselves acceptable to God. And for some of us, that's been harder because our struggle is something that we have really wrestled with. We're like, does God accept this? Does he accept me as this? And we're so afraid that this is going to be the deal breaker for us. And we all have these questions. All of us have them. And what happens is when we do this, we begin to sort of reduce him down to our perceptions. This is the essence of what the Bible talks about. It talks about idolatry. There's one of the most prevalent prohibitions in the Bible is that against idolatry. Do not set up any graven images. Do not have any idols. And idols aren't just statues. It's anything that we set our affections over in place of God. And the essence of idolatry is our tendency to remake him into our image, right? We remake him into our image by saying, oh, God can't be that way, so perhaps he's this way. And we just reshape him to fit and to suit our preferences. We reduce him to fit our preferences and our systems that suddenly make our desires acceptable to him. And what happens is this standard of right and wrong, we love gray because it allows us to create loopholes and find justifications to all kinds of things. And what I want to tell you when we look at this, you can be completely right in obeying the laws and completely wrong in a relationship with him or anyone else. This goes way beyond being acceptable. This is about belonging. And what I want to remind you, what I want to ask you or invite you into is to consider this. This is not just about living or finding an acceptable lifestyle or acceptable behavior, but is living as one who has been accepted. And this is a big difference. This is a big difference. So here's what happens in the life of Abraham. Many people know the story, and it begins in Genesis chapter 22. Abraham and Sarah have miraculously had Isaac in their old age. This was the promise that God had given to Abraham, that you would have a son, and through your lineage would all the nations of the world be blessed, which interestingly enough is occurring. Through all the nations of the world would be blessed. And then he asked Abraham to go and to sacrifice his son. Here it is in Genesis 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. Now there's the first line. God tested Abraham. He put him in a situation where he's going to have to make decisions that are going to conflict with what he feels is right, that are going to conflict with what he feels like ought to happen. It's going to conflict with what he already knows. God tested Abraham. And here's what Abraham says. I love his reply. Here I am. It's just, okay, here I am. God comes to Abraham and he tests him and he calls his name, and Abraham says, okay, here it is. And then here's what he says. In verse 2, he says, I want you to take your son, your only son, to Mount Moriah, and I want you to offer him as a burnt sacrifice to me. What? Like, can you enter into that story and think about the angst of what that feels like? And so what you read is one of the first mentions, this is the first mention of worship in there. Abraham and Isaac go on a journey. Hey, son, we're going on a little father-son excursion here. Why don't you come with me? Sure, that'd be awesome. They go up there. He says, we're actually going to offer a sacrifice to worship our God. And Isaac's like, yo, where's the sacrifice, Dad? And Abraham's, don't worry. God will provide one. Don't worry. Gets all the way up there, and in our Western modern minds, we think, how in the world could God do this? How could God ask Abraham to offer his child? And more importantly, how could Abraham have discerned that that's what God said to him? Why would he think that a thing? Here's why. Because in that culture, child sacrifice was very common. This is the ancient Near East. There's gods who demanded child sacrifices. What they all knew, and you can understand this, what they all knew is that gods needed to be appeased. They were fickle, they were fragile, their favor was fragile. And so they needed to be appeased. You needed to do something in order to keep things sort of working the way they're supposed to work. If someone, think about this. If you come home and your mom is furious, you go and you ask your brother, what did you do to mom, right? And then you figure out what you're going to do to butter her up to get her in a better mood than what she's in. You're going to offer something to her. Mom, you're awesome. Or I know brother's a doofball, or whatever it is to make her feel. We're going to offer some things to her. This is the way it all worked in the ancient Near East. Imagine this, that there's no rain and the crops are about to die. The crops are about to die and everybody's like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? They're like in the ground and they're beating the ground and they're pleading to the God of rain. Can you please send some rain because our crops are going to die? And there's some dude over there going, don't you forget about me. And they're like, whoa, what are you doing? And all of a sudden the next day it rains like crazy. The next time there's a drought, they're going to find that guy and go, what was that you were singing? Because whatever that was, like, well, God likes simple minds. What can we do with that, right? And so if you don't know simple minds, I'm sorry, I can't help you today. That's a whole other lesson. But the point is they would find things that seemed to have been favorable to God. And when they couldn't get God to act on their behalf, they would start throwing animals at him or their crops at him, or eventually their children, going, God, will this appease you? Would you send rain? Would you send this? Would you do this? If we just offer you more and more and more. And that's how these systems worked. So for Abraham to think to sacrifice his son was to believe that God was just like all the other gods. And so off he goes. So he gets up to the top, he binds Isaac. I don't know if there was a tussle or if there was a sort of scuffle in that as Isaac binds his son. And I can hardly even allow myself to visualize this as he puts his son on the altar and he raises the knife to kill him and God intervenes. And this is how it reads in Genesis 22, verse 10 and 11. Then Abraham reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven. And he says, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham stops and he says, here I am. And this posture of Abraham is constantly, God, whatever it is that you want, whatever it is, Father, I'm here for whatever that is. I'm available for whatever that is. And he says that you don't harm him. And he lets him go. He says, you've withheld nothing from me. And then in Genesis 22, we read this, verse 13 and 14, it picks up and he says, Abraham looked up And there in the thicket, he saw a ram caught by its horns, and he went over and he took the ram and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day, it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided. Abraham, when this happened, he found the ram and he stopped and he called the place Jehovah Jireh, the Lord is provision. So here's what's important. As most of us have heard, a lot of you perhaps have heard this story. And what you hear is, oh, that God is faithful. Oh, that God is faithful. And what I want us to see is something much, much differently. When you think about what God is doing in and through his scriptures, that he is revealing himself to us relationally. The governance that God is calling us into is one of relational. This is what we talked about. We offer our bodies a holy sacrifice as one who has been accepted. We talked about what Jesus did last year, was that not only are we acceptable, that we have been accepted in learning to live as those who have been forgiven. So we're offering ourselves as one who has been forgiven. So what is obedience about? Over here, what you'll understand is that obedience under the law is basically about compliance, because if you do what you're told, then you'll be acceptable. And this is how a lot of us end up living. So what does obedience look like over here? What does it look like? What are we seeing in Abraham? The first thing, a couple of observations, is one is God is always revealing himself relationally. And what Abraham encountered about God is something really profound. What most of us have heard is that the story of Isaac is just basically don't withhold anything from God. Don't withhold anything from God. It requires something of you. A walk with the Lord requires something from you. That is true. But God wasn't just revealing a way for us to get better favor with God. He was inviting us into something. And what we see that Abraham did is so important. Once this happened, Abraham stopped and he named the place. He named the place and he identified what it is that God had done. And what I think happened is what Abraham encountered, what he saw about God was something really, really profound. A child sacrifice was something that every other God would have required. And when God stops Abraham, you know what Abraham probably thought? This God is not like any other. This God is not like any other God. There's something different. And so he stops. And he said, not only did God not require this from me, he actually provided something for me. Abraham encounters a God who cares enough to provide. This is where I think a lot of us get lost. When we're offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, we're not trying to prove to God or earn something or take something from God to earn his favor. We offer ourselves to him as those who have been accepted for some other reason, for something else. What I think we are doing, what I think happens here is that when we talk about this, that when we offer our bodies to him, what we are learning is that this idea of this act of obedience isn't just for you to sort of curry favor with God, but rather to experience his care for you and in your life. For a lot of us, this is what happens, right? You think that obedience is something when God's testing you, that it's like a pass or fail thing. If you don't do well, you're off. If you do well, you're in. But he's always revealing himself to us. God is revealing himself. This is the way relationships work. The things that you know about someone after being married to them for almost 30 years are significantly different than the things you knew about them when you were a year in or in the early days. Because relationships are always revealed. There's no amount of information you can get in those first days to tell you or to help you understand what you need to know 20 years from now. It's experience together that allows that relationship to become what it is. It's for us to walk with each other, to respond to each other. And the way we respond to God is out of obedience. That's what he asks of us. Jesus said this. He says, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. John 14, he says this. I remember reading that and it sounds one of two ways to me. It either sounds like a threat. Jesus is either going, if you love me, you better obey me, right? If you love me, you'll obey me, because if you don't, I'm bringing down the smackdown. Or it sounds like he's whining. If you love me, you would do what I said, right? It sounds one of the two. And I don't think it's either one of those. I think what he's saying is, in this way over here, to respond to him is quite instinctive and quite natural. And what I would suggest is for most of us, it's not. That's why we have to reorder. That's why we have to reorient. That's why sacrifices are important. That's why we bring ourselves to him and say, God, today I belong to you. Today, what I have, I'm offering to you, because what I want to understand is I want to experience something from you. A crisis of faith. I don't know where you are in yours, but if you have not had a crisis of faith, you will have one. Anytime you walk with the Lord, and this is one thing that I don't want to be. I've been walking with the Lord for a long time. I do not want my stories of God's faithfulness to be 20 years old. I don't want them to be, oh, back in 1999, man, God, what back in 2003 God did. I don't want to be talking about what God did when I was 20 or 25. When I'm 50, I want to be talking about the things that God did when I was 49. What that means is we got to keep walking, we got to keep trusting. He's going to put us in situations where we are uncomfortable and where things are new and where we're not sure how it's going to turn out. And guess what's going to happen almost every time when you get in a situation and you're not sure how it's going to turn out? You're going to want to go back to the way that it was. I know for me personally, this whole thing that we've been through the last year, 20, I've been resisting going back to normal the whole time because I think going back to normal is a disaster. And now we're getting to where the end is in sight and we can feel the pressure to go back to normal, to get things back the way they were. I think God is calling us into something new. And we've got to be aware that's going to require something from us. It's going to require us to see things we haven't seen before. My learning curve at this point in my life is probably steeper than it's ever been. Most pastors in their 50s have got all their theology figured out and they're just doing, just telling you how it is. And me, I'm still learning a lot about God. I'll tell you what I've learned. If you think that you know everything you need to know about God by the time you're 35, your God is way too small. And a lot of people end up living like this. He is unlike any other God. That's how he wants to reveal himself to you. That's how he wants to show himself to you. And he does that by inviting you to obey him. Do you know why? Because it is when you obey him, you don't get brownie points. When you obey him, you experience his care for you. The reason that some of you have never experienced God's tender care for your soul and for your life is because you've never stepped out into those places to experience that. What Abraham found is when he put his son on the altar, he discovered that God was not like any other. God wasn't just going to be appeased by something. God was going to actually step in and care about him enough to provide. And he named that place. Have you named a place in your own life? Do you have a place where you've pronounced God's faithfulness to you, or you've pronounced God's work in some definitive, articulated way? I mentioned this earlier to you, but I have a rock in my office. And when that rock sits up there, it reminds me that God cares enough for me to guide me. There were decisions we were making that day that I had no idea if they would be right or wrong, if they would work out or not. And I was betting the farm on it. God, if you don't come through, we're dead in the water. And what God said is, I'm gonna put my steps in front of you. I'm gonna order your steps so you can trust me to guide you. And that rock serves to remind me that God cares enough to guide me. My checkbook, right? We started Port City Church in 1999. We cashed in everything we had. It was about 9 years of hand to mouth. A lot of times not knowing how you're gonna pay your bills or which bills to pay. It was all that. And I'm not complaining. I'm not trying to say that because I haven't sacrificed anything that God hasn't given back to me way beyond what I deserve. But my point is, there was a point in time when you look at your checkbook at the end of every month and you're mad. I don't have enough. God, I can't believe you're doing this. I'm doing all this for you. Why aren't you coming through for me? You ever had those moments with God? Instead, I began to change that. At the end of every month, Julie and I would sit down and we'd go, oh my gosh, he did it again. Do you see the difference? Oh my gosh, he did it again. We thought we weren't going to make it, and somehow we did, and we're still going, and oh my gosh, he did it again. And every month was this, so the checkbook became a reminder that God cares enough to provide. Do you have places like that in your life? I have a quote in my office. It sits right above where I can see my computer monitor. It sits right above there. And that quote is just a reminder to me. It's a reminder to me to encourage me that God cares enough for me to encourage me to continue with what he's doing. I'll tell you, these days and this season of the church have been among the most difficult and the scariest because you don't know how disconnected people really are from the church. You just don't know a lot of things. And the temptation is to just get back to the way things were and tell everybody what they want to hear and just keep doing what we've always done instead of pursuing the future that God has. The quote, by the way, says the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And it reminds me that God cares about me enough to give me vision and to call me forward. And he encourages me in that because I need to be encouraged when I want to do all the other things except that. Do you have reminders, places in your life where you know God has done things for you? A walk on the beach can be a reminder that God cares enough to calm me or to calm you. My journals have places in them where it's God cares enough for me to be patient with me. In my journal, I have all kinds of whiny prayers. I don't know if y'all have this or not. And people used to drive me crazy, I'd put their initials in there. So when I died, nobody knows I was talking about you. This person, I put their initials in there. I'd be so mad or so tired, and I'd just write their initials in there. And it's so funny. This went on for, sometimes month after month after month after month about this same person. And now I look back 10 or 15 years later, I can't even remember whose initials that is. Do you know what that says? That says the things that consumed me for months when I was 25 and 30. I can't even remember who that person is 15 years later. It's a reminder that God is patient and he meets us. I can tell you story after story after story. There were things and decisions along the way that were gut-wrenching and terrifying. And what I've learned now is even as the future looks as uncertain as it ever has before, I can tell you personally, the gospel has become more beautiful to me than it ever has in my life. The potential and hope of the church and the opportunities we have as a church are more fresh in my mind, and I have more drive and ambition and excitement about the future than I've ever had before. It's why I get up in the morning. And these are things that are they're fresh and they're new because we keep walking, we keep participating, we keep walking with him, obeying, doing what he's asking us to do. And ultimately, what I've come to believe, what I've come to learn in those crisis moments when you're not sure if this is going to turn out like you want it, that somehow the fact that God cares enough is enough. And I can depend on that. Y'all, I remember when I was in, and it's so funny because these crisis moments come. When I was 21 or 22, when I was 19, I felt like God was calling me to be in the ministry. So I said, God, I'll surrender to the ministry. I did this thing down in front of our church. I'll surrender to the ministry. So I go down there and I do this, and then 19, and now I'm thinking I'm in college now, and so now I've got to figure out how to get into the ministry faster. So I said, I'm gonna change my major from architecture, and I'm gonna change it to like computers so I can get out of school like a year and a half earlier, and that won't have to deal with all the late nights and stand up all the time of architecture. So I thought, that's the right thing to do, and I felt like in my soul, like, no, you need to stay with architecture. He's like, I'm gonna need you to learn how to write in 30 years, so stay at it. So I did. And then I'm thinking, like, if I'm God and I'm working on my life, then what you do if you're calling someone in the ministry is you make their distaste for architecture, or you decrease their desire for architecture, and you awaken it for this other thing, right? You start to do that. And you create opportunities for me to do those other things. Well, instead, what happened was, all along the way, I ended up working for an architect in college. I ended up in college with a pretty good job offer to finish my last year in college. And when I got out of college, I had a really, really good job offer in architecture. And I'm like, God, why? Like, why would you do this? And what he was inviting me to do is to go, do you trust me with everything? With everything. See, a lot of us have learned about surrender that you ask yourself, and this is not a bad question, it's just incomplete. What do you withhold from God? What does he withhold from him? I think a better question is, how can I entrust everything to God's care? When you surrender, you're not just surrendering the stuff that you withhold, right? You're surrendering everything. We offer our entire bodies as one who has already been accepted. And our acts of obedience aren't to bid his favor in our lives. They're to experience the freedom that he's actually come to bring us. What's on the other side of your forgiveness? I want you to encounter a God who is like no other. Who is like no other. And he is unbelievably careful. One of my favorite paraphrases, 1 Peter chapter 5, it says, humble yourselves before God, In due time, he will exalt you. Cast your anxieties on him. And Eugene Peterson translates it this way. He says, live carefree before God, for he is most careful with you. And some of you have not experienced that because you haven't stepped out. That's where it's found. I think that's what he's asking of us. I think that's what he wants to show us. Father, I ask you to just meet us in this moment as we consider not just the sacrifice of what we withhold from you, and there's probably a list of those things as well, but rather as we think about offering our whole selves to you. God, I pray for those who are in these crisis moments. Their faith is hanging by a thread and they're not sure if you're dependable or believable or good. That somehow what you do in this moment would beckon them to trust just enough to take a step. And in that they would experience the carefree invitation to live freely and fully before you. You are most careful with us. God, we want to experience that in every moment. We lift all of this in the name of your son, Jesus. I'm going to invite you in the room, church in the room, if you'll stand as we make this last declaration together.